And I'm an assistant state attorney for the 20th Circuit. I'll be representing the state. We haven't had a chance to meet. I'll be representing the state of Florida in this case. Over here again, you had an opportunity to meet Cynthia Ross. She's my co-counsel in this case. This portion of the trial is the opening statement, and this is the opportunity for us to lay a roadmap for you about what evidence we intend to introduce during the trial in this case. I want to thank you for your attention throughout jury selection and for your continued attention as we move forward. In order to tell the story of this case, you have to start at the end and move forward to the beginning. It sounds like a conflict in terms. This case was about the perfect marriage, the perfect friendship, the perfect alibi, the perfect murder. It was almost perfect. The case starts on June 29th, Monday, June 29th, 2015. Dr. Teresa Sievers was due at work at her medical practice here in Lee County, and she didn't arrive. So the staff at her office made efforts to locate her. She had patients. She was a general practitioner, family practitioner, and she had appointments with patients to see that morning and that afternoon. You're going to get to hear that the folks in her medical office reached out to her husband, Mr. Sievers, Mr. Mark Sievers. And he won't be on trial today. Where's Dr. Sievers? People made phone calls to try to locate her. You're going to hear from a family friend, Dr. Mark Petridis. Dr. Petridis is a longtime friend of Dr. Sievers. They're friends and colleagues. They first met when she was doing a medical school internship. Dr. Petridis at the time, he's now retired, but at the time he was a surgeon. He was still practicing medicine back then. He received a call from Mark Sievers, the husband, which was odd, to say the least, because Mr. Sievers didn't really call Dr. Petridis. Dr. Petridis was more Dr. Sievers' friend, not Mr. Sievers' friend. Dr. Petridis is going to tell you that Mr. Sievers said, hey, I need you to go to the house and check on Teresa. It was an unusual request, but it sounded urgent, so Dr. Petridis, at the time, he wasn't far away from the Sievers home. He'd been to the Sievers home before, so he knew where it was. He proceeded to the Sievers home. During the short trip to the Sievers home, he continued discussions with Mr. Sievers, who continued to urge Dr. Petridis to go into the house. Dr. Petridis was a little concerned because, for all he knew, Dr. Sievers was undressed, asleep, indisposed, didn't want to walk into the house and surprise his friend. He also knew that Dr. Sievers had been practicing with firearms, and it wasn't a good idea for him to surprise a person at home who might be armed. Mr. Sievers gave Dr. Petridis the code. Some of us who have garage doors have a little box outside the garage door where you punch a code in and the door goes up. Mr. Sievers gave Dr. Petridis that code, and Dr. Petridis put the code in, and the door went up. The odd thing that happened is the door went up. The first thing Dr. Petridis noticed, that the door from the garage door, which went into a laundry room and then another door into the kitchen, was open. And one of the Sievers dogs came running out of the garage. He thought it was odd. The dog ran out into the yard. Probably had to do what dogs do. But it was different. And other times that Dr. Petridis had been to the Sievers house, he hadn't seen that door open. Concerned for his friend, Dr. Sievers, Dr. Petridis called out to her. No answer. So he proceeded into the home to locate her and make sure she was okay. As he got closer to the kitchen, he saw something on the floor of the kitchen. he realized that what he was looking at on the floor of the kitchen was his friend, Dr. Sievers. As he stepped into the kitchen, he noticed copious amounts of blood on the floor and injuries about her head. She wasn't moving. She was lifeless. Again, Dr. Petridis is a surgeon. He's trained in detecting life. He reached down, put his hand on Dr. Sievers' back. She was cold. She was lifeless. He knew that his friend was dead. The next thing Dr. Petridis did was call for help. He called 911. Even though he was pretty sure that there was nothing EMS could do for her, he called. She had been brutally beaten and was bloody on the floor of the kitchen, so he called for help. Fire and EMS arrived at the house shortly afterwards. I think they arrived shortly before the law enforcement officers arrived. They went into the home. Didn't even really break the threshold of the kitchen, because they could tell from looking at Dr. Sievers that her injuries were inconsistent with life. This was the beginning of a months-long investigation that would result in the arrest of Jimmy Rodgers, Curtis Wright. You're probably going to hear reference to Mark Sievers, Dr. Sievers' husband. The Lee County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene and began the investigation. They weren't able to locate any immediate leads. Dr. Sievers is home alone in her home. She's been, for all intents and purposes, beaten to death. But the home appears to be in good order. It's not ransacked. There aren't any valuables missing. There are televisions in the home. There are computers. Ms. Sievers' wallets in the home. There are samurai swords on the walls. There's a locked office, which was easy to open, that had money in a big jar, one of those water bottles that you put on top of the water cooler at work. It had money in it, about a quarter of the way full of money. There was a plaque with money on the wall in that office. There was money on the desk in that office. There were electronics in that office. There were gun holsters. The guns were locked up, but there were holsters that would have led a reasonable burglar to know that there might be guns in the house. There was ammunition in plain view. Not taken. There was fine dining ware in the cabinets in the dining area. Not moved, not taken. There was a computer at a desk. Not moved, not taken. There was even a portable keyboard in the living room area of the home. Not taken. Everything that was supposed to be in that house appeared to be in that house, with the exception of Dr. Sievers' lifeless body. Next to Dr. Sievers was a hammer. You're going to get to see pictures of it. You're going to get to see the hammer. It was laying on the kitchen floor just behind her. You'll see it in the pictures. And around that hammer was some hair. And the hammer had a brown substance on it consistent with dried blood. The autopsy would later reveal injuries to the head of Dr. Sievers consistent with impact from a hammer. Possibly that hammer. Probably that hammer. Possibly another. The only thing that the medical examiner could tell was, of course, that Dr. Sievers died from the medical definition of a homicide at the hand of another person, and that she died as a result of being bludgeoned to death. During the autopsy, however, there were samples recovered from Dr. Sievers. There were tape lifts taken from her body, fingerprints, bloodstained cards. Even though the sheriff's office could not find any immediately discernible leads to how Dr. Sievers could have ended up dead in her home, they still continued to gather as much evidence and document the crime scene as much as they could. Because if they didn't do it now, the evidence may not be there later. The gathering of the evidence from the scene left no discernible leads. This truly was a mystery to the detectives. In a case like this, where a young woman is killed in her home, it's natural for some folks to say, where is her lover? Where is her spouse? Where is her significant other? Could they have had the passion to do this? Well, Mr. Sievers was up north with Dr. Sievers' family in New York and Connecticut. Dr. Sievers and her family, her two daughters and her husband, that weekend, I want to say on the 26th of June, and you'll hear from Ann Lisa, her sister, and she's going to tell you what date they arrived in New York. But the whole Sievers family went to New York. There was a celebration up there with her mother. So Dr. Sievers and her siblings and her mother all got together for a weekend of family fun. Also present were the two daughters, Josephine and Carmi, and Mr. Sievers. The plan for that weekend had been for Dr. Sievers to leave Sunday night. And Mr. Sievers and the kids were going to go back to Connecticut with other family members. She was going to fly back by herself because she had patients to visit Monday morning. So Mr. Sievers was thousands of miles away when Dr. Sievers passed away. Again, another part of the mystery. Then a break in the case came. And it came from all places from the state of Missouri. Mark Sievers is from Missouri. So the detectives, the Lee County detectives, and you'll get to hear from Detective Michael Downs, and Detective David Lebed. At the time, Mike Downs was a detective. Now he's a lieutenant. At the time, David Lebed was a sergeant. Now he's a lieutenant as well. You'll get to hear from Lieutenants Downs and Lebed that they took what they thought was going to be a one-day trip to the Jefferson County area in Missouri. It ended up being a much longer trip as they followed lead after lead after lead. And they slowly began to circle in on two suspects, Curtis Wright and Jimmy Ray Rodgers. Over here. Mr. Wright was quickly identified as a person of interest in the case, and their investigation into Mr. Wright led to Mr. Rodgers. On or about July 18th of 2015, we're weeks past the death of Dr. Sievers. The detectives would go to Mr. Rodgers' home to interview him and ask him if he knew anything about what happened to Dr. Sievers. Mr. Rodgers denied knowing Mark Sievers and denied going to Florida. statements were proven to be untrue. In fact, Jimmy Rodgers had met Mark Sievers. They weren't friends. They weren't even really associates. But they had met in May of 2015 at Curtis Wright's marriage. He got married in May. Jimmy Rodgers was there, along with his then girlfriend, Taylor Shoemaker, or Showmaker. Mark Sievers was the best man in Curtis Wright's wedding. We've got pictures of Jimmy Rodgers at that wedding. So the notion that he didn't know Mark Sievers was untrue. The notion that he never met Mark Sievers was untrue. He said he hadn't been to Florida. Detectives Levitt, Downs, and the rest of their staff at the Lee County Sheriff's Office would later prove that to be untrue. Guess how? There were electronic footprints. When you step outside your home, folks, you're always being observed. The Sheriff's Office undertook an unprecedented campaign to download video recordings from gas stations between here and Georgia. Jimmy Rodgers is on video at 2 different gas stations in Florida. Folks, he had been to Florida. Then, one of the biggest breaks came when the Sheriff's Office downloaded video from the Walmart. One of the Walmarts here in Fort Myers. Ironically, it's the one on 6 Mile Cypress Parkway. One right down the street from LCSO headquarters. Step outside of the headquarters and you look down the street and there it is, the Walmart, or the traffic light to the Walmart. On that video, there's Curtis Wright and Jimmy Rodgers on Sunday, June 28th, walking around in the Walmart shopping. Clear as day. So, Mr. Rodgers had been to Florida. Further investigation into Mr. Rodgers and his place of employment would also reveal that he had actually told an employer that he needed time off from work. Why did he need time off from work, ladies and gentlemen? Because he had to go to Florida. Another tidbit, another piece of the truth. Both Curtis Wright and Jimmy Ray Rodgers left digital clues. When I say digital clues, I'm not talking about these digits. I'm talking about electronic clues behind, in addition to the videos. An examination of Curtis Wright's cell phone. The Sheriff's Office seized his phone. Got a search warrant. Gave it to a digital forensics examiner at the Sheriff's Office. They plugged the phone into a computer and they downloaded the data out of the phone. There appeared to be coded messages between Curtis Wright and Mark Sievers. Between the day of Mr. Wright's wedding, when Mark Sievers was in Missouri by himself, without his wife, without his children. From that date forward, there were coded messages. And those messages led the investigators to believe that there was an other phone. And you hear the significance of the word other when you get to hear from the witnesses in this case. Mr. Wright was, as the investigation continued, the investigators did discover that Mr. Wright had been to Florida sometime after June 30th to come to the aid of his friend, Mark Sievers, whose wife had passed away, and to go to the funeral. There was a rent-a-car that he and his wife, his brand new wife, Angie Wright, had driven down in. That rent-a-car was located in Missouri, and within it was a Garmin GPS unit. Some of us probably have little portable Garmin GPS units. You stick it to your windshield. Maybe it stays up there for the entire trip. Probably falls off at some point. But you stick it on your windshield, and the Garmin tells you where to go. When they did a forensic examination of that Garmin, they found, the Sheriff's Office Forensics Unit found digital footprints of that Garmin, not just traveling to Florida on or after June 30th, but before that. On Saturday, June 27th, they found map plots from Missouri all the way to Florida and back. There was also search data in there. Somebody had been searching for restaurants and other things in the GPS unit. That GPS unit was a special GPS unit because those of you who have a GPS unit often know that if you don't spend the extra money, your GPS unit is a standalone unit. You put in the address and it navigates where you are. You may not get traffic updates. You may not get weather updates. You may not be able to search for specific things depending on how advanced your unit is. This particular unit was capable of establishing a Bluetooth connection with a cell phone. It had connected to a phone at some point while it was plotting back to Missouri. And when it made that connection to the phone, the user, their phone had an email address associated with the phone that was connected to the Garmin GPS unit, the Garmin GPS unit that was in Curtis Wright's rental car. I'll give you one guess what the email address was. One. You get one guess. JimmyRayRogers90@gmail.com. Okay, so now the Sheriff's Office knows that, okay, something is wrong. We know that Curtis Wright has been to Florida. We know that Jimmy Rodgers has been to Florida. Doesn't mean they did anything, but they're not being honest about whether or not they came to Florida. The next break in the case would come from Taylor Shoemaker. Remember I told you earlier that Taylor Shoemaker, the then girlfriend of Jimmy Rodgers, had gone to the Wright wedding with him? She contacted law enforcement. She contacted them. She had been present during a previous encounter with Mr. Rodgers and the lieutenants when he denied coming to Florida. She became suspicious. She became suspicious of her boyfriend for a couple of reasons. She knew that he'd been out of town. He told her he was going out of town. She knew he'd been out of town on the day that doctor in Florida had been killed. That was the first clue that something was amiss. The next clue came to her when, after the initial visit by detectives to Mr. Rodgers, he did something unusual, probably almost unconscionable to most reasonable people. He took his cell phone and he soaked it in water. Then he broke it into pieces. And he had to drive. He asked her to go with him back to his job. At the time, Mr. Rodgers was working for a contractor that was working at a lead plant of some kind called Doe Run in Missouri. And one of the things that Mr. Rodgers was doing was working with the disposal of lead. Lead's toxic. The workers in that plant, one of the things that they did, one of the many things that they did to avoid getting themselves contaminated by lead, was they put on these big, heavy blue suits, overalls or coveralls, long legs, long sleeves. You zip it up. You step into it and you zip it up. They wore these thick, heavy rubber gloves, and they would wrap themselves up to avoid contamination. They wear booties on their shoes to avoid lead contamination. You're going to hear that Mr. Rodgers was trained. He was trained on how to avoid contamination. Same training that could be applied in avoiding contamination of a crime scene, or avoid contamination by a crime scene. So he drives to Doe Run, he and Miss Shoemaker. On the ride to Doe Run, he instructs her to throw the pieces of his phone out the window. Who does that? So his phone's been soaked, broken, and thrown out the window. He also at some point had to return to Doe Run to fetch a blue suit. One of those big, heavy blue suits we were talking about. He had her throw that out the window also. You're going to hear testimony that there were bins there at Doe Run where the employees would put their contaminated suits so the suits could be appropriately cleaned or disposed of. He threw his out the window, or had Miss Shoemaker throw it out the window. Miss Shoemaker would later lead Lieutenants Downs and Levitt back to the road where she threw the items out the window. But before she did that, she confronted Mr. Rodgers. She was his girlfriend. She has a child from him. She wanted to know if Mr. Rodgers had done something to that woman in Florida. And you're going to hear her tell you what he said to her. That he and Mr. Wright went to Florida to kill Dr. Sievers. And that he, Mr. Rodgers, had killed her with a hammer. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know her, never met her. He did it for money. He was expecting a payday. Those blue suits are important because remember when I told you earlier about the evidence collection process at the medical examiner's office? They had done lifts on Dr. Sievers. There were blue fibers on Dr. Sievers, consistent with the fibers from those suits. The suit that was found on the roadway, it had been out on the roadway for weeks in the elements. It had actually been apparently run over by lawnmowers. You'll see pictures of it laying in the grass all shredded up with grass on top of it. So recovering any forensic evidence from the blue suit was a long shot, but not for the FBI. The suit went to the FBI, to their Trace Evidence Analysis Unit. One of the things that they recovered from that suit was a hair. Whose hair was it? You're going to hear that there was mitochondrial DNA testing done of the hair. Mitochondrial DNA testing is a type of testing that can relate individuals by their maternal DNA. It's used in instances when there isn't enough blood or when there's only hair. It's a special kind of DNA testing. The FBI also had what's called a reference sample or a control sample from Jimmy Rodgers. And the sequencing on the mitochondrial DNA from the hair recovered from the blue suit and the hair plucked from Jimmy Ray Rodgers was the same. It was his hair on the blue suit. So Taylor Shoemaker's testimony is corroborated by scientific evidence. Unfortunately, the phone is destroyed. You won't be able to see a data download from what used to be Mr. Rodgers' phone. It was obliterated. So now we know that Mr. Rodgers was untrue about being in Florida. We know that he's been here. We have video evidence that he was here. We have trace evidence putting one of those Doe Run blue suits from all the way in Missouri on Dr. Sievers. So Mr. Rodgers gets charged for his role in the death of Teresa Sievers. On or about September 10th, 2015, Lieutenants Downs and Levitt go to a holding facility where Mr. Rodgers is being held. And the purpose of the visit is to give him a chance to tell his side of it.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
The purpose of the visit is to get a statement from Mr. Rodgers.
Objection.
Can I have both sides approach for a moment?
So the detective.
One moment.
Sorry.
You ready? Okay. Okay.
So the detectives went to the holding facility to talk to Mr. Rodgers. We're going to tell you he was combative, yelling at them. At some point, during their encounter with him, he asked what the charges were. He was then informed that the charges were second-degree murder. Whereupon Mr. Rodgers responded, in the state of Missouri, second-degree murder, punishable by 15 to 20. I'm okay with that.
Overruled.
And he left. There's more. I told you earlier that Curtis Wright had been charged as well. I think there was a discussion between you and Ms. Ross during voir dire about that. Curtis Wright was charged. He's going to tell you that he and Mark Sievers, lifelong friends. They were kids in high school. They were close friends. Over the years, they kind of grown apart as they both had families and moved on with their lives. But in recent time, prior to 2015, they'd gotten close again. They were very close. Mr. Sievers was still familiar with a lot of his old associates back in Missouri, where he was from. Mr. Wright, being charged with this crime, struck a deal. A murderer. A murderer of unarmed innocent women. But he struck a deal with the state in exchange for leniency from the state. 25 years in prison, which at his age might mean he may not get out. In exchange for his testimony, he agreed to tell you about what happened to Dr. Sievers. He's going to do that. Mr. Wright is going to tell you that at his wedding, on or about May 2nd, May 1st, Mr. Sievers had arrived in Missouri on or about April 30th. At some point, he told Mr. Wright that he needed to talk to him about something. Nothing important, but we need to talk. The night before the wedding, Mr. Wright and the soon-to-be Mrs. Wright were kind of having a joint bachelorette party with their close friends. Mark Sievers was there. Jimmy Rodgers was there. Taylor Shoemaker was there. And at some point, Mr. Sievers wanted to talk to Mr. Wright. The two of them went off into a private room, and Mr. Wright's going to tell you about the conversation. But the gist of it was, what if somebody was having a problem with their spouse? What if I had a friend that was having a problem? And maybe they needed to get rid of their spouse. Do you know somebody who could help me with that? Mr. Wright, a little taken aback. I can ask around. It was an odd request from his longtime friend. But they never got to finish the conversation at that point because they got interrupted by family and friends. They were kind of off in a room together, just the two of them, and everybody else was elsewhere in the home. The next day was the wedding. And it was a kind of a low-budget wedding. It was done at a local park. Mr. Wright was apparently doing his own catering. He had transported food to the park for the guests that were coming to the wedding. And at some point while he was getting ready, they were getting dressed, he realized that there was a tray of meat missing that he had forgotten to bring. And the tray of meat was being stored at one of those big refrigerators at a store, about a 20-minute drive away from the park. He knew the guy at the store, and the guy agreed to store the meat for him. So he had to go get the meat for the guests. So he's the groom and he's the caterer for his wedding. Mr. Sievers offered to drive him to pick up the meat. On the drive, which was about 20 minutes there and about 20 minutes back, 5 to 10 minutes on site, getting the meat into the car, Mr. Sievers engaged Mr. Wright again about this spouse. But now it wasn't, I know a friend, it was Mr. Sievers having problems at home. See, Dr. Sievers' doctor, powerful woman, was making the money. Mr. Sievers told Mr. Wright, I don't want to lose my daughters. I can't win that fight. The only way I can win is for her to die. Can you help me? Mr. Wright agreed to try to find some help. At that point, he hadn't yet made up his mind about whether he would actually participate in this crime. But he believed his longtime friend when his friend told him how desperate he was. Mr. Wright reached out to Mr. Rodgers for help. Even though Mr. Sievers and Mr. Rodgers had met, Mr. Sievers didn't know that Mr. Wright was reaching out to Mr. Rodgers for help. Wright was the middleman in this conspiracy. If you open up a law textbook, it's what's called a line conspiracy. From A to B, from B to C. Mark Sievers was A, Curtis Wright was B, Jimmy Rodgers was C. Mr. Wright reached out to Mr. Rodgers for help. And during that period, got a burner phone or a prepaid phone. He and Mr. Sievers both got prepaid phones. And the coded messaging that was on their personal cell phones, the word other, was a go code. Check your other phone. Check your burner phone. And the time period between about May 17, 2015, up until the murder, Mr. Sievers and Mr. Wright planned the murder of Dr. Sievers. And Mr. Wright and Mr. Rodgers planned the murder of Dr. Sievers. Mr. Sievers told Mr. Wright that, hey, we're going out of town for a family get-together the weekend of June 26th. This is the time. Teresa's coming back by herself. Mr. Sievers also sent $600 to Mr. Wright. Mr. Wright didn't have a lot of money. He didn't have a way to pay his way down here. He used that $600 to rent a different rent-a-car. So he rented a car, drove down here with Mr. Rodgers, killed Dr. Sievers, drove back to Missouri, turned in that rented car, he got another car, and came back down with his wife for the funeral. Lee County Sheriff's Office found that first car in Arizona with blue fibers in it. So, Mr. Wright uses the $600 that Mr. Sievers has sent to him to rent a car for him and Mr. Rodgers to drive down. Mr. Sievers also provided Mr. Wright with intelligence information, so to say. Aerial maps of the neighborhood, how best to get into the house undetected. Provided him with the keypad codes for the door. Told him he would leave the side door unlocked. Provided keypad codes for an alarm at the business. There was a discussion about whether or not Dr. Sievers should die at home or die at the business. Maybe make it look like a crime gone bad. Maybe it was best for her to get murdered at work. These were some of the discussions Mr. Wright had with Mr. Rodgers and with Mr. Sievers. So that weekend, on the 27th, in the early morning hours, Mr. Wright in his rented white Hyundai Elantra Enterprise rent-a-car picks up Mr. Rodgers, who had a backpack with him and a cooler. And inside was blue suits that we will submit to you were from Doe Run, and gloves, and duct tape. And the two of them embarked on a nonstop journey from the Jefferson County area, Missouri, to Bonita Springs to kill Dr. Teresa Sievers. During the trip, they hadn't yet made up their mind when or how to kill her. Mr. Wright had a couple of ideas in his mind. He's going to tell you. Ideally, it would be nice to maybe put her in a chokehold and choke her out. Maybe hit her in the head and throw her in the pool, make it look like she drowned. Make it look like an accident. They actually went to the Sievers medical practice, scouted that out. Is there a way we can make this happen here? Decided, no, it's better to do it at the house. So on the 27th, in the early morning hours, they left Missouri and drove to Florida and arrived in the Fort Myers area at about 6 a.m., Sunday the 28th. Went to the house, disarmed the alarm system, kind of checked things out, left the house. Went to the beach, Bonita Beach. Went to Walmart. He's going to tell you he went to Walmart, tell you he did some shopping at Walmart because Mr. Rodgers didn't have any beach clothes, among other things. They hung around for the day. Mr. Wright's going to tell you he was expecting Dr. Sievers to return later Sunday night.
I'll ask all jurors to turn off your phones and any people out in the audience as well. Thank you.
I needed a break. Thank you. Okay. Mr. Wright's going to tell you he was expecting Dr. Sievers home late Sunday night. He knew she was supposed to arrive at about 11:20, 11:30. But he wasn't sure whether her flight was landing at 11:20 or 11:30, or whether she was going to be arriving home at 11:20 or 11:30. Needless to say, he and Mr. Rodgers were in the Sievers home. They had suited up, put on the gloves, wrapped up the duct tape to avoid contamination, and they were in the house, and they were trying to get ready for Dr. Sievers to arrive. You're going to hear Mr. Wright tell you that at the time he was out in the garage, Mr. Sievers had a motorcycle in his garage. There was an old Mercedes vehicle in the garage, a motorcycle, and then the family also had a Toyota Sienna van. The Toyota Sienna van was the van Dr. Sievers was driving home from the airport. Thinking that he still had time to prepare and to stage for Dr. Sievers, the two men were in the house kind of hanging around, looking around the house. While Mr. Wright is standing in the garage looking at the motorcycle, to his surprise, the door starts going up, the garage door. Not knowing what to do, he dove on the floor behind some boxes and behind the motorcycle because the van was coming in, and as the van was turning into the garage, the headlights were going to light him up. So he dove behind the boxes. He's going to tell you he didn't know where Mr. Rodgers was. He knew he was somewhere underneath the roof of the house, but he didn't know where he was. Two of them were kind of hanging around in the house, waiting for Dr. Sievers, but not expecting her to arrive at that moment. She pulls in. She gets out of the van. She's unaware that she has two visitors. She takes out her little rolly suitcase and puts it down on the floor of the garage. And it proceeds into the house. Mr. Rodgers falls in behind her. She doesn't know he's there. And she doesn't know that Jimmy Rodgers is in the house. And this time, Mr. Wright, the plan is blown. She arrived ahead of schedule, didn't know what to do. He grabs a hammer. He knew that Jimmy Rodgers had a hammer because Jimmy Rodgers was playing with a hammer earlier, made a crack about it being Dr. Sievers' destiny, something to that effect. So he follows her into the home. And the plan was to try to come up behind her, put her in a chokehold or something. But as he's following her into the home, his foot kicked a dog bowl that was on the floor. There were two dogs in the home. I mentioned earlier one of the dogs ran out. And he said the sound was like a gong. Now his presence in the home is revealed. Dr. Sievers had time to put her purse down and turned around to see Mr. Wright standing behind her. She looked at him like, why? And Mr. Wright hit her with the hammer. He hit her again, and she started to fight with him. She had her hands up, trying to protect herself from fighting with Mr. Wright. Mr. Wright's going to tell you that at some point, Mr. Rodgers came out of nowhere. He's either going to use the word berserk or the word crazy, but he's going to say, Mr. Wright went crazy on her. So while she's fighting with, he's going to say Mr. Rodgers went crazy on her. While she's fighting with Mr. Wright, Mr. Rodgers engages with his hammer. And he starts hitting her. And she's trying to fight them both. At some point, she bends over at the waist, has her hand on the counter, I think he's going to say. You remember having her hand on the counter because she's still fighting, even though she's being overcome by a hammer. Mr. Rodgers continued hitting her until she fell down on the floor. And then Mr. Wright now, because Mr. Rodgers was kind of going crazy on Dr. Sievers, he actually got between Mr. Wright and Dr. Sievers. Mr. Wright dropped his hammer, which is the hammer that is in the scene that you're going to see. He was panicked. Didn't expect that to happen. He grabbed Mr. Rodgers and told him to stop. It's done. Stop. Grabbed him. The plan was, again, to stage the house like a burglary. But now panic has set in. He grabs Mr. Rodgers and goes to leave the house. So I got to get the suits off. Mr. Rodgers runs back and hits Dr. Sievers again. in the head, back of the head. You're going to get to hear from the medical examiner about the injuries. That's where her life ended. There were no other witnesses to this crime. Mr. Rodgers, Dr. Sievers, and Mr. Wright. This is not Missouri. This is Florida. Jimmy Ray Rodgers is guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Jimmy Ray Rodgers is guilty of first-degree murder. And no, Dr. Sievers did not give him permission to come into her house and beat her to death with a hammer. Therefore, he's guilty of armed burglary. Mr. Wright had permission to go into the house, but Mr. Rodgers didn't. Over the next several days, you're going to hear all this evidence. And after you hear all the evidence and you hear the instruction from the court on the elements, you've heard the instructions already. You'll get to hear more detailed instructions from the court about what the elements of conspiracy are, what the elements of first-degree murder are, what the elements are of armed burglary. You're going to be asked to apply the evidence that you hear and see in this case. Apply the evidence and the facts to the law. Ms. Ross and I are confident that once you do that, you're going to find Mr. Rodgers guilty of murder, first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and armed burglary. Thank you.